Trump imposed a 10% tariff on Chinese goods, which hardly made any headlines. This is because everyone was captivated by his even more outrageous move, a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. To be honest, such a crazy move was initially considered by most to be political blackmail, but no one expected him to actually go through with it. Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, with a grave expression, announced reciprocal retaliation against the U.S., and the Mexican president also stated that Mexico would not allow itself to be bullied by the U.S. and would take retaliatory actions. However, to be frank, these two countries have limited capacity to retaliate against the U.S. Since Trump dared to slap them in the face, he must have calculated the consequences and simply doesn't care. Currently, it is expected that Canada's trade countermeasures against the U.S. will focus on the oil sector. However, since this is a double-edged sword, the Canadian government is hesitant to act rashly, while other trade sanctions have already been prepared for by the Americans. Mexico's countermeasures are even more limited, as the U.S. can compensate for the trade gap through countries like Vietnam, and American businesses have already stockpiled goods. So the impact will not be significant. Trump's reckless actions signal the death of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the credibility of the U.S. government has taken a major hit. From now on, no country can trust trade agreements with the U.S., because whenever the U.S. government feels displeased, it may wield its sword against its trade partners. U.S. national policy has also entered a unilateralist state, with Americans holding a big stick and hitting anyone they dislike. The only way to avoid being beaten by the U.S. is to curry favor with the U.S. president, who is an unpredictable figure. Any political, diplomatic, or economic ties with the U.S. have become unpredictable. In reality, many of Trump's actions may seem crazy, but the logic behind them is simple. He aims to advance his goals of reducing federal spending and increasing revenue, ultimately to achieve large-scale tax cuts in the U.S. and stimulate the recovery and development of manufacturing. In other words, he understands that tariffs are ultimately borne by U.S. importers and consumers, but he doesn't care. What he wants is tax cuts, and tax cuts require someone to fill the federal government's deficit, which can be covered by tariffs. Moreover, Trump's team has calculated that this move will not significantly increase U.S. inflation or noticeably raise the cost of living for ordinary people. Although it's unclear how they arrived at such a naive conclusion, it's evident that Trump firmly believes in this, otherwise he wouldn't be so reckless. We won't comment on Trump's intelligence, but let's briefly analyze whether U.S. manufacturing will gain a favorable development opportunity and rise again as a result. To understand this, we need to know where the money printed by the U.S., which holds the power to print currency, goes. Yes, the answer is clear. The U.S. military-industrial complex, Wall Street financial elites, and Silicon Valley tech moguls hold the majority of the nation's wealth. Most of the U.S. Fortune 500 companies are controlled by the same few investment entities. Whether it's traditional companies like Walmart and Coca-Cola or tech giants like Apple and Google, their major shareholders are largely the same: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and other financial groups, whose interests are highly aligned. Why don't these companies develop manufacturing but instead import goods and components from other countries? Because these financial groups are also profit-driven. Building production lines, dealing with labor unions and workers, and facing significant environmental pressures generate far less profit than speculating on financial and tech concepts, cashing in on projects in Silicon Valley and Wall Street. In other words, it's not simply that manufacturing has chosen to leave the U.S., but rather that the U.S. financial groups, which hold the nation's wealth, are unwilling to engage in low-profit, high-risk ventures like manufacturing. This is well explained by the principles of economics: comparative advantage and opportunity cost. Even if the Trump administration prepares all the internal and external conditions for developing manufacturing, as long as U.S. financial groups have investment options that are more lucrative than manufacturing, the opportunity cost of U.S. manufacturing will remain high, losing its comparative advantage. This is common knowledge that even non-economics majors in Chinese universities, as long as they've taken an introductory economics course, can understand. But the US president doesn't get it, and someone so lacking in basic economic knowledge is now steering US economic policy. How can such a country become great again? Mexican and Canadian workers labored diligently to provide Americans with the most cost-effective goods and services in the world. Companies from these two countries have no bargaining power in the face of the massive US market, and most of the profits are taken by commercial giants like Walmart and Amazon. They are not taking advantage of Americans, nor are they stealing jobs from US workers. In fact, even if they were to exit the US market, these businesses would not choose to build production bases in the US. Instead, they would find alternative producers in countries like Vietnam and other Southeast Asian nations. This is because managing a manufacturing center is far more costly, risky, and complex than simply importing and distributing goods. Trump greatly admires McKinley, as McKinley significantly raised tariffs during his presidency, which to some extent protected the development of the U.S. steel and textile industries. However, McKinley's tariff barriers brought severe negative consequences, increasing the prices of imported goods, driving up domestic price levels, burdening ordinary citizens, and provoking harsh retaliation from other countries, ultimately leading to bankruptcy. Before leaving office, McKinley himself admitted that there are no winners in a tariff war. Finally, I have a bold hypothesis. Trump is plotting a major plan, and the tariff war and economic war are merely cover for this grand deal. After all, he is a businessman, and doing something so irrational in the 21st century defies logic. Perhaps he has already realized that he cannot defeat China in the short term, and the US must accept a long-term coexistence with China. But before that, the US needs to complete some major deals to amass enough capital to gain an advantageous position in the ensuing long-term Cold War. For example, the US may seek control over key locations like Greenland, Canada's Arctic territories, and the Panama Canal, forming a trade system entirely led by and subservient to the US government, independent of China. To achieve this, he might sacrifice some allies' interests, such as reducing security commitments to Japan, South Korea, and NATO, while making significant concessions to Russia to win its support against China. In short, everything must be negotiated within his brief 4-year term to create his personal political legacy and secure his place in history. If this process requires sacrificing the interests of other countries, he won't bat an eye. At the same time, Trump also needs to secure enough benefits for his family. His launch of meme coins is a classic example of using power for personal gain.